Hello, I'm Mark McKee, Managing Editor for the Missouri Review. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of 3 videos celebrating the winners of the 29th Annual Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize. Ordinarily, we fly the winners into Columbia, Missouri for a reading and reception, where we nosh, gab, and raise a glass or two while enjoying the readings and conversation with our winners. Alas, in 2020, this is, as the kids say, not the move. We hope that you'll enjoy the adaptation that we've cooked up, which at least has the happy capacity to be shared widely with no cost but your time. Having lived with the winning poems for a while now, though, I'm here to tell you that your time will be richly rewarded by the poems and conversation you're about to hear. Joining us tonight will be Heather Treseler, the 2019 winner in poetry for the Lucie Odes, who will be introduced by our new poetry editor, Jacob Griffin Hall. Just a quick bit of news. Tressler's chapbook, Parturition, of which the Lucie Odes is the core, just received the Jean Pedrick Award from the New England Poetry Club for the best chapbook published in New England this year. Jacob Griffin Hall is the poetry editor of the Missouri Review. He holds an MFA from Bowling Green State University, where he worked as assistant poetry editor for the Mid-American Review, and he is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Missouri. His poems have appeared or are forthcoming in New South, Diagram, the Carolina Quarterly, New Ohio Review Online, the Indianapolis Review, and other journals. Jacob Griffin Hall.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Heather, for being here. I have the honor of introducing the winner of our 2019 Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize in Poetry, Heather Treseler. Tressler's elegiac The Lucie Odes are as stunning in their technical precision as they are moving. These poems accomplish something rare, something that's hard to put a finger on, but having read them, that you can't shake off. In the Lucie Odes, Tressler memorializes the life of Lucie, a beloved who the speaker meets while teaching a night class. The poems wrestle with Lucie's traumatic past and bold reclamation of her present. They walk through the speaker's initial friendship, their shared history, and the friendship's eventual evolution into profound intimacy. At this point, I've read the Lucie Odes more than a handful of times. Each time I read them, I find something new to marvel at. The first time, it was the sheer power of Lucie's life and the speaker's power in memorializing it. The fifth time, it was the meeting of language and form, how Tressler's voice weaves through the tercets with deft precision that feels both unexpected and inevitable. The last time, it was the way the poems reach into the history and the traumas of St. Louis beyond the lives of the speaker and of Lucie. The poems imagine Eliot's St. Louis as he spent time, quote, plotting revenge against the failures of his flesh. They also process the city's trauma in the wake of the police murder of Michael Brown in the summer of 2014. They recoil at the violence of a world where, quote, futile sacrifice of someone else's child is a week of headline news, and county officers exact salary and pension from carceral zip codes. These are just some of the things that make the Lucie Odes enduring poems, poems that you can read through again and again, each time leaving the page energized and bawling. While they're poems about profound love and profound loss, the Lucie Odes are not poems only about love and loss. They are tributes to an incredible life. They are negotiations of trauma that is shared and trauma that could never be shared. They are testimonials to the joy and warmth found in loving another person. And they are powerful odes to the person at the center of the poems who is loved, Lucie. Please welcome the winner of our 2019 Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize in Poetry, Heather Treseler. Thank you for being here, Heather.
Thanks so much for having me. It's both a pleasure and honor to be with all of you and with our tertiary audience, whom we can sort of conjure and imagine. I think tonight I'm going to read 4 of the 10 Lucie Odes, the first 2, and then 2 from the latter part of the sequence, the 7th and the 10th. And I'll talk a little bit before each ode, just to sort of fill you in on what's happened in the meantime. After Lucie died in October of 2018, I got the news actually when I was in in my department office. I'm an English professor now. And I got the call late in the day, just after I finished teaching my poetry workshop. And as I come back to my office, I had actually just taken off the counter in the strangeness of fate, a framed picture from a magazine story that I had written about our very unlikely friendship. And I just sort of placed it back on the bookshelf when the phone rang. So I do believe that on some level there is a deeper wave. And it took me probably 6 weeks to come up with what would be the first line of this poem. But once it began, it was sort of an obsessive project, a way of reclaiming her in some way, and her truly epic life. So this first ode begins with Lucie's escape from, I think, what most of us would regard as almost unspeakable exploitation, sexual exploitation. And it's sort of the hero's escape from Troy, in a way. The Lucie Odes. Part 1. I'd known you 6 years before you told me how your first husband had pimped you out. Used the cash to buy a fried chicken franchise along a rural highway in Alabama. How you slept under the counter where you cashiered wings and thighs. How you rinsed out back and spread baby powder across a bath towel to soak up the tumid August sweat, keep off skittering roaches. For the rest of your life, you had nothing to do with chicken, mixed in memory with the smell of strange men's semen. How you dreaded what came despite roughshod precaution. How you stole from the till $1 at a time until you had enough for a bus to a clinic. I picture you there alone, benumbed, draped and gauzed in a steel theater, vowing never to seek what had been siphoned. How after he hunted you with a shotgun, not to get you back, but to put the narrow shape of you under his dirty boot, under carmine soil. He called you darling pay dirt, his working girl, and promised broken knees, a bullet in each palm, a tongue ribboned and your eyes gored in primitive backwoods punishment and burial. This second ode engages a little bit with T.S. Eliot, who of course was one of the many famous literary citizens of St. Louis, but he was also someone who Lucie was reading. She was working class, but extraordinarily self-taught. And once Lucie had left the South, she settled in St. Louis and began a career there in sort of the most unlikely of ways. Ode 2. 27 bucks got you as far as St. Louis. Once the gamble of the young Thomas Stearns Eliot, an indoor creature, his double hernia delicately trussed as he daydreamed of his mahogany future, staring into the glass of Proof Rock's furniture, plotting revenge against the failure of his flesh. You heard on the radio that Eliot was the great poet from St. Louis, so you bought his quartets, recited the liturgical lines as you washed floors nightly at the medical school. There you met Dr. Fisher, famed neuroanatomist, fugitive of Kristallnacht, who insisted on cleaning his own lab to Wagner's Flying Dutchman. He saw your mop and asked your name. Within a week, you'd offered to work for free if he would train you in pathology and to his surprise, you loved perfusing tissue, fixing slides, teasing disease into blooms of legible color. You did not flinch at gutted cadavers or dank shit of euthanized chimps. Neither of you spoke of a past, of men mechanized in murder who killed off a sister, or the dark knives in a drunk mother's slurry kitchen. Both of you, schooled in subterfuge, took temporary refuge in never looking back. I'll skip to the 7th ode, at which point Lucie and I had become very close friends, and she had begun to teach me much of her own life's philosophy, which was this remarkable blend of Wollstonecraft and Darwin and Marx and Alice Walker and everything in between. And there's a reference to the habendum clause, to have and to hold, which comes to the marriage ceremony through real estate law. So the 7th ode. We dreamt of a love outside of proprietary rights, the subtle tyranny in the habendum clause, to have and to hold, in the contracts for land and slaves, water rights and wives. Many women, you said, don't realize they must direct their own fate. But if you are your own master, you stirred bouillon into the boiling pot, then there's no need to offer your body as daily remittance for safety or children, the leisure to love in a suburban kitchen, in a quaint town with low crime rates, good schools. To live without mortgaged desire, to husband your own strength, to take or dismiss lovers from your own sweet bed by the court and jury of your opinion, to have and to hold your body without boot or bank or another's name, to depend on no man. Take it from me, kid, from this chrome chair. Habendum is freedom, that diamond-tipped obsidian, that most feared thing, a woman's mind without border, box, or ceiling. Measure your loves by how they espouse your license to live with nothing hid or hindered, halved, withheld, largesse that never leaves you less. And I'll conclude with the 10th ode, which is the end of the poem. In the 8th ode, there is a sort of foreshadowing of Lucie's death. But I wanted to tell it as well and as respectfully as I could. There's also a reference to King's Highway, which those of us in Missouri all recognize as being one of the main thoroughfares through St. Louis. It was also the scene of where Lucie had sustained an accident that had left her partially paralyzed. The 10th ode. I got a job and left for good, relieved as young Eliot to part from the murder and middling mud of the Mississippi, its ritual riverbed on burials, unsettled silt that clots at the heart. You had promised to retire, to settle your affairs and join me in New England and a house by the ocean. How selfish then and now, my love for you, O woman, more than mother or lover, and both. Because there is no escape from the wheel, no quota for how much one soul must freight, infection began to roil in your unfeeling flank, and I wasn't there to see you naked. Too late, surgeons chased its septic reach, coring deep into bone. You forbade me at your bedside. Work and write, Cherie, it isn't yet time for worry. I begged. On the phone, your gully laugh, old smoker's warble, balm of your voice reaching from the morass you felt to be your sinking body. The nurse assured me that there was no sign of distress or harm, your flesh still warm. Atheist, anarchic, no barefoot Jesus on your horizon. You took one last spin down King's Highway, where you stood, where you strode from that steaming wreck, leggy, lone, owning no one but yourself.
At this point, we're gonna pass to Jacob and then Bailey, our contest editor, and then me again. And we're gonna ask Heather some questions about these poems. And again, we're gonna start off with Jacob, rather.
Thank you so much, Heather, for reading those. That's incredible to hear you read through those poems. Yeah, thank you so much. So in your author's note, you talk about how these poems were written in the 10 months after Lucie's death. And it seems to me that people experience writing in the wake of such a loss differently. Whereas some people turn to the page and find it healing to whatever extent it can be, while others experience the writing as its own sort of grief or trauma. And you talked about this a little bit when you were introducing the poems, but I was wondering if you would mind discussing your experience writing the poems. What was it like for you writing inside of and through grief?
That's such a great question. I think one of the hardest things when Lucie died was that there was no one word to describe what she had been to me. There was no shorthand for it. And I longed to be able to continue our conversation, which at that point had spanned 10 years. We were in almost daily contact for much of that time. So I was riven with grief and haunted and needing to find some way to find some way into language about all of that. And so it took a while, maybe 4 or 5 weeks before I started writing. I sort of waited until I knew the first line. And then once I had the first line, which is sort of one of the more shocking parts of Lucie's life, her essentially being forced to work as a prostitute in her 20s. I knew that I had a way into telling her story. So the odes just kind of grew over the 10 months, and I had, I think, about 8 odes by March of the following year. But it wasn't actually until I was given legal permission to act as her beneficiary and executor and enter her apartment that I felt that she had left me various signs and indications that it was all right for me to write about what had been an incredibly private relationship between the two of us. We were known as friends, but very few people, I think, knew or intuited that we were also much more than that. And it was a whole host of things, including finding her original will, almost like a joke wedged between 2 books about Napoleon, a historical figure whom she had a lot of fondness for. And finding a stack of my essays on her bedside table, some of them marked up. So I felt at that point, so this was maybe late spring of 2019, that the odes weren't complete. There was something missing. There was some glue that hadn't arrived. And that was really the 8th ode, the 8th, 9th, and 10th odes, which were all written in the spring of that year. And then strangely enough, as luck would have it, I had a fellowship from the T.S. Eliot House in Gloucester, Massachusetts, to spend some time in Eliot's family's summer house, which is filled with Eliot paraphernalia and sort of the ghostly feeling of Eliot. So that sort of helped me work in some of the Eliotic references in the poem and think about her love of Eliot, among other things. So Jacob, that's a very long answer to your excellent question, but I would say that it was lengthy and obsessive, but in the attempt to make something beautiful of an extraordinary life, I think it was ultimately, for me at least, somewhat healing, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, Heather. Thank you so much. I'm going to echo Jacob by saying that that was incredible to be able to witness and hear you read those. My name's Bailey Boyd. I'm the contest editor here at the Missouri Review. And my question is also about process a little bit. I was really drawn to the poems in which the history is being recounted, in which the speaker didn't share that history. So some of that history that that the speaker was not part of. And I was wondering what the process was for writing those particular poems, and if that was different than maybe writing the ones in which the speaker had a shared part in those stories.
Sure. As I sometimes tell my shock students, poems sometimes involve research. They sometimes involve a lot of research. And in this case, I had Lucie's archive to work with. So, for example, Dr. Vernon Fisher, who had narrowly survived the Holocaust, he was a childhood survivor. He was a famous neuroanatomist in St. Louis, and he was the one who actually found Lucie when she was working as a janitor at St. Louis University and taught her how to be an electron microscopist, which was a pathway for her into a professional life. And I was fascinated by his story. And there were documents about his life that she had collected over the years. And I was fascinated how the two of them had found each other as survivors of sort of unspeakable horrors. But I took a lot of care in representing Vernon's story and their connection, and trying to imagine that moment in which they first talked to each other across such vast class and educational divides. As for other references to Michael Brown's death, which when Lucie and I were living in St. Louis when that occurred, we went to a protest downtown after Brown's body was found. It was just part of the informing context of our own conversation, our own wonderings about human nature and cruelty and hatred. And then as for the research on Eliot himself, there's a really wonderful book, I'm sure most of you, of course, know about it already, by William Gass and Lauren Cuocho, which is a literary guide to St. Louis. It has all these juicy details about St. Louis, including that there was this place called Proof Rocks Furniture, which is probably where the title of Eliot's famous poem comes from, and that Eliot himself was quite sickly as a young boy. I also really enjoyed Robert Crawford's biography, excuse me, of Eliot's early life, in which he details poor Thomas and his double trust hernia and his ambition to sort of overcome his physical liabilities. So I guess I would say, Bailey, that a lot of research went into the poems to And it's always a bit of a dodgy process, I think, when a poet is on some level playing biographer, but I tried to maintain fealty to the truth as much as I could.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'll echo our other two, our poetry editor and contest editor, by saying thank you again for giving us the opportunity to hear those poems read. The more time I spend with these poems, Heather, the larger they seem to grow. I have a half a dozen questions probably percolating in my mind, but I'd like to ask just one that gives you the most space to talk a bit more about the work, which is just as we've all said, is marvelous. Often, and to my sensibility, the best a lyric poem can hope for is a kind of moment of transcendence or epiphany that its form and content is just basically the grounds for. I find in your series, in the Lucie Odes, a kind of slow rollout of several epiphanies of the body, of the self, of the relation of that self to other selves, the structures that we kind of like, that we suffer by and that we proceed by. I wonder if, could you talk about what epiphanies you experienced in writing these poems? I mean, I know that on some level it was a navigation of grief, but I wonder again, like, what epiphanies and catharsis were there for you, and what you might hope for. And I know you would never necessarily speak to the experience of a reader of your poems, but what might you hope for? What might you hope that that they get?
Well, I think on some basic level, I would want to introduce them to Lucie, who was just the most extraordinary person I have ever met or known. And so much of her story is an American story. It's one of transition across classes. It's one of escape from violence. It's also about the very purposeful construction of the self. And in my cheekier moment, I think in the poem, I'm referencing Eliot's construction of himself next to Lucie's construction of herself and her philosophy and the ways in which she sought to live and to love. And Missouri itself is sort of the crucible of the country. It is the place of the Missouri Compromise and the Dred Scott case, a place of vast differences, but also of tremendous beauty and deep stratified layers of history and culture and richness. So I guess if I can share some portion of that with the reader, I've been somewhat successful. I think personally too, that what Lucie had to teach me, an able-bodied person, about being a woman, and she had this feminist brand of philosophy that was all of her own making, but it was deeply informed by evolutionary psychology and Marxism and French philosophy and a score of other things that she had reached to understand her own experience. And that, distilling a portion of that in the poem was quite fruitful for me, and I would hope that it might also be useful for the reader in some way.
I think it certainly was for me. And at this point, I think we have some time if there's anybody, any of our other editorial staff who'd like to ask a question. But if there is but if there's not, and we'd just like to move on, the next person that we'll talk to is Chris Somerville. All right. Well, I'll just say thank you again so very much for the poems and the conversation. And I will hand the mic or the screen, as it were, the spotlight to our marketing director and the sass of our outfit, Chris Somerville.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I know, I really understand we've all had a full day of working, teaching, some of you are parenting, and all of us are just trying to deal largely with technology in ways that we could never have possibly imagined. Thank you to Heather Treseler, whose poetry continues to win awards and is really inspiring. So thank you, Heather. Of course, our good friend, Jeff Smith, who generously endows this prize and really does indeed exist. We saw him last Sunday, and we really appreciate Jeff Smith and adore him. We adore our board, who sticks with us year after year. And then Mark McKee, Jacob Hall, and Bailey Boyd, who put this event together and are now just working wildly hard to make this year's contest as successful as all the ones in the past, and they've been very, very successful. And then thank you to our staff and our interns who have sort of committed themselves to this wild adventure of literary magazines. So thank you for a great evening, and cheers to you all. And that's it. Good night.